You gonna read something?
Yeah.
All right.
Are we ready? All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm Henry Lucas, the chair of the Design Media Arts Department. Welcome to the EDA, and we're here to start our first lecture in the DMA 2010-11 series. And it's a real pleasure to announce our first speaker, who is also our Arts Council artist in residence for this school year. I've met Brian several years ago as a student at CalArts, and I was doing a lecture there. And at the time, Brian was working on a Joy Division publication, which he asked a lot of designers to create an image based on a song, right? I don't know whatever happened to that publication, but oh, it's still happening. Anyways, I saw his graduation show, and I knew for sure that this guy would be super successful. His body of work is enormous for such a young designer. I think he's. I'm a huge fan of his work. He's a vegan, and apparently he doesn't sleep ever because he works a lot. He primarily works as a graphic designer under the moniker Handheld, and it's an apt name choice for Roettinger, whose work can be heartfelt, hardcore, and everything in between. Brian is a CalArts alumni. He graduated in 2004. He's also a Grammy nominee. In 2009, his CD packaging for the band No Age got him nominated. Did you win that Grammy? No. Oh, whatever. His work primarily moves in between the arts and the music world, and I'm happy he's here. He's going to teach undergrad classes for this year, but he also will meet with the grad students if they ask for it, and I'm going to give you the floor. Thanks.
Can you hear me? Check, check. This is, I just want to put, I love the packaging of these pears. I just want to take a look at it. Let's put it up here. Sorry. Sorry. Before I show you some work, I just wanted to say a few things about myself that will hopefully put my work in some sort of context. Like Henry said, I kind of go back and forth between work for cultural institutions, artists, but also doing sort of low-key independent projects with bands and musicians, and sort of my own self-initiated projects. First, I want to say I live and work in Los Angeles more so often under the moniker Handheld Heart, like Henry said. Before I studied design, I studied film, but was sort of always more interested in music and sound, whether if it was performance or just recorded. I played in a band before I was doing design called This Machine Kills, and we were quite loud and obnoxious and kind of lucky, actually. After I sort of felt that I wasn't really going anywhere because the music that I preferred to play and was interested in was not really going to be commercially valuable for me. So I decided to go here, CalArts, and I did study for 4 years. Skip that. But after I graduated from CalArts, about a week after, I began working here, which was the brand integration group at Ogilvy and Mather, which is a installed sort of design, this group of designers working within an ad agency. And I lasted about 4 months, maybe. And for me, it was really difficult because I was so used to making physical things and tangible things that actually were made. And in a advertising agency, you spend so much time just with R&D and nothing ever got made. And it sort of drove me crazy. We had great ideas, but it was sort of nothing was ever physically done. They would always sort of make us move along as soon as a project was almost complete. So it kind of drove me crazy. My last day here, this building actually is in Culver City, called the Stealth Building, designed by Erico and Moss Architects. And ironically, my last day here was my first day here. Literally, I went from a goodbye party birthday cake to a welcoming party a pizza party, an hour apart. And ironically, this is Sci-Arc, which is directed by Erico and Moss. So I went from a building that he designed to an institute that he directs sort of in one day. And I was only out of school for about 5 months. So I instantly sort of felt more comfortable being in a cultural academic institution rather than being sort of at the desk of a ad agency, just sort of twiddling my thumbs and drawing on Post-it notes and stuff. It was fun, but it wasn't, like I said, it was fun. So as I continued to work at Sci-Arc, and I was there for about 5 years, from 2004 until the beginning of this year, actually. And as I was working at Sci-Arc, I was simultaneously juggling outside projects under Handheld Heart. I would sort of be at Sci-Arc during the day, and then at night I would have my own studio. And a lot of the work that I show was sort of done at that time while I was sort of living these two lives, juggling sort of responsibilities of being a director or the design director at Sci-Arc to coming home and sort of having to deal with or work on these sort of smaller or sometimes larger projects. So one thing about Handheld Heart now is it is not only myself, but as it is also a sort of handful of collaborators who are architects and designers and artists as well. Fail again, or try again, fail better. For me, this quote actually sort of explains my process and my projects quite well. They're in the relationships I have with printers, especially. A lot of the projects that I do, I feel more comfortable when there is the potential for a project to fail or not work. I'm sort of really comfortable being uncomfortable in a way. Because for me, that outcome of the project is completely unknown in a way, to where if it does fail, for me it feels like I tried something new. If there's the potential that it's going to go completely smooth, I feel like I'm not doing enough. So I kind of always go back to this quote because it actually helps me. Oops. And then just want to go back to this image of Sci-Arc. This was one of the last things I did when I was there was take this image. I just thought, if you're not familiar with the school, it's an amazing place to go check out. So the first image that I want to start off with is a 7-inch record, which was sort of my gateway. I like to say that the album and 7 inches, of course, were sort of my gateway drug into design. It was instantly sort of the first few things that I designed, but it was once I sort of got into them as objects, I was instantly sort of obsessed. So this record was something I did prior to having any knowledge about design, before I studied design. And what it was at this time was, with the records that I was putting out, they were on a limited basis, and people were buying them in sort of stacks of 5 or 10, and then instantly putting them on eBay and selling them for 10 times more than what they were paying for. And it was kind of frustrating because I was sort of breaking my back making them and not making sort of any profit, but just being excited that they were out. And then people would buy them, sell them on the internet, and be profiting way more than how I was profiting. And there's no way I would ever be able to catch them. So I figured out an idea where what I would do is, for this record particularly, which was mail order only, what I did is everyone that ordered the record, I etched their name in the actual vinyl. So, and I kept a list of everyone who owned the record, and if I saw that they were trying to sell it online, I would know who bought more and who sold them. And certain people a handful of people would try to buy more than one or more than two with fake names and stuff. So over time, I had to ban people from ordering records because they were, profiting more than I was. But a little bit, I want to go back and talk a little bit more about the record label that I did start and sort of what my intentions for starting it were. I wanted to start a label that focused more on just releasing music in sort of a traditional label sense. Here's some music, here's a package, here's a record, just listen to it. And I did start this sort of pre-digital. It was about 1995. So right before MP3s, right before, 5 years before MP3s and iPods. So there still was this object-oriented and obsessiveness about sort of records out there, that people were still purchasing records quite frequently. I wanted to sort of treat each release and object as an artifact, as well as try to create an experience with each release. So as soon as someone got it, they can put it on the record player, listen to it, and have the packaging as something to sort of interact with, rather than just putting it on, setting it aside, and listening to it. And I'd say that's something I still try to continue to do, especially with album packaging, is move away from the sort of traditional label sense of just doing a record with a cover and then that's calling it a day. But I'll touch base more on 7 inches later. Then I quickly want to go now here to Sci-Arc, and a lot of the work that I'll show from Sci-Arc also is pinned up. I think you get a better sense of them, as the materiality of them as physical things. And they, as images on screen, they don't really give so much justice, really. So, first, my responsibilities at Sci-Arc as the design director, which ideally I was, but they would never say that, only because there was a director at the school, and no one else could be called director if he was called director. But I was directing design, so I gave my name that title. But the projects really ranged from sort of day-to-day posters that were in-house to mailable things, low budget to no budget to high budget. But it was always stuff that was sort of immediate. Everything at the Institute was sort of, whenever the project came in, it was already sort of late. They wanted something, for yesterday, always. So the quickest thing to do, which was for these in-house sort of posters, was just to develop a simple typographic sort of system that we could just plug in and had a lot of variables. So there was some variation, but they were all sort of done quickly and just printed in-house, and always the same size, always the same typeface. A few different grids that applied depending on how much content there was. These are, I think, these are a selection of maybe a few years' worth. So over time, they kind of morphed and kind of changed. But the projects did vary from sort of, and this is a poor picture, but the projects did vary from posters to gallery signage to gallery posters, which in the same sense were things that really you were given the content. I was given the content on a Monday, and they needed to be designed and printed sometime by Thursday, which, if you know, is kind of sometimes impossible. So I had to develop an idea in which I could have these things produced quickly. And my only solution was in the printing technique. So one thing that I've always been, one sort of printing technique that I've always been a fan of was web press printing and newsprint printing. What web press is it prints on paper that's not cut to sheets. So the paper comes from a roll, sort of like how a newspaper prints. So what the printers usually are familiar with doing are projects where the quantity is 10,000 or 20,000 or even 100,000. So when I would come to them and say, I need 200 or 500, they would, at first they would just laugh. So it was only about a year after the first project that I did with this printer for these particular posters, where the first one we did 500, and 3 years later we were doing, I think, like 6,000. But it was kind of amazing to just give the printer the files on a Monday morning, see a proof Monday evening, Monday afternoon, and have them Tuesday morning. It was so satisfying in a way, but it was also so limiting. But the restrictions were sort of, I embraced them over time, sort of embraced the crappiness of the printing, because newsprint it is really crappy. It gets on your hands. The reproduction isn't so well, but I kind of love that. So another sort of ongoing project with the Institute is every year there would be a selection of student work that would exist in publication, in poster form, and would be distributed to other institutes and distributed to the students as well. And this is another sort of project that was done on newsprint, done sort of quickly. And a lot of these I have up here. I just want to go through some of them really quickly. And the projects sort of, the one thing about Sci-Arc that I always tried to do was install some sort of idea in the format and in the material, the materiality of everything that was made, whether it was like on the left printed on newsprint or on the right letter pressed on really heavy sort of chipboard. So there was this contrast in the material from going from really thin, cheap newsprint to going to this really dense, heavy sort of chipboard. So you really begin to become aware of them as objects. So in this particular publication, which was on newsprint, it's sort of, there was a template that was set in place, and we received the content. It sort of trickled in over, over time. And so there was just a template set in place and plugged in and sort of thing. Another one of the ongoing projects there was, I don't know if you've been to the school, but the signage is absolutely terrible. You arrive there and you have no idea where to go, where to enter. And once you're in the school, you have no idea where anything is. The building is a quarter of a mile long, a former freight depot, and at its widest length, it is 60 feet. So you really are just going east and west. You can never go north and south because it's really, really narrow. And all the walls in the Institute are used for classrooms. There's not that many rooms. So the walls are sort of canvassed with work and used as crit walls. So really there's no space for any sort of signage because at any time it could be covered with work. So the only available consistent space really was the floor. And so the idea was to use the floor as the space for signage and how that it would exist. The building, the ground was completely concrete, which had been redone in, I think, 2001 or 2002 when the school moved there. So it was definitely hard and definitely dry. Concrete takes, I think, around 5 or 6 years to fully dry. It may appear hard, but it's still sort of expanding. So what I did was just have all the signage sandblasted into the ground of the concrete, about 1/4 of an inch, and just under 1/4 of an inch. So you could see it from a distance, but you could also, once you got up close to it, it was really noticeable. And it was the same technique that is used on headstones. And it was really simple in its process. The gentleman who did it just came in a little tent with his sandblaster and did it. And I asked him if I could actually just go in there and watch it, but I think he got freaked out. Another thing at Sci-Arc that while I was there, that I really tried to exploit was use the resources of the school to influence the work that I was making for the school. So there, in many ways, ideas that would come through in architecture and architectural production would perhaps show in the design. So in this case, I used the 3D milling machine, and I mean, I felt in 2007 that milling machine was the future. For me, at least, I had never seen anything like it. Or a little before that, I'd never seen anything like it. So now I feel that you see them everywhere. But at this time, what I did was create a sort of template that the machine would just die cut the letters out. And I did 3 different series of these objects which just cut out the information. And I documented the entire process of how these were made from not only from this stage, but onto the stage of having them vacuum formed. So they went from being die cut on the 3D milling to being vacuum formed into these thick eighth inch polypropylene plastic sheets, which were just over almost to scale of the size of the poster, a little big, about 4 feet by 2.5 feet. And essentially, they became the image for the poster, which I think is maybe hanging up there. But for me, it was more interesting in the process of how everything was made, of how that poster was made, and researching or going to the website to see each step along the way sort of played out quite well. Another one of the sort of 3D milling things was eventually just sort of using it to generate signage. So in this case, just cutting out the title and then using the laser to etch out the names, which you could see. Also at Sci-Arc, they have a Sci-Arc store which sells art supplies and supplies to architects. And during the holiday season, they get quite busy. It's like their busiest time of the year. So in this particular time, they wanted to do a series of gift certificates. So instead of the sort of natural, here's a letterpress or here's a printed card, I wanted to do something that sort of had a monetary value, which you would get it as a gift certificate, and you would have to bring it back. You'd have to sort of use it and give it back to them, and it sort of would go back and forth, whoever purchased them. So the idea was that the material that the object was made out of, the material's weight would reflect the value of the certificate that you had or the object that you had. So in this particular case, for $50, the idea was that it would be, its weight would be 50 grams. So whatever material we could find to keep it to somewhat a relative scale and be 50 grams is what we did. So there was this dense wood, and 50 grams is about 3¼ pounds, I think, or it was a 6¼. But what ended up happening is the 50 was this size, and then the 100 was a different material, so it was almost twice as big. And the $10 certificate or $10 object was quite small. But in some ways, it defeated the purpose because people would get them and want to keep them. And not that, I mean, I think we did maybe 10 of each value, and every time I would go to the store, they would say, "Oh, we have one left." And by the time I left the school, they were all gone. They didn't have any more. So people would buy them, and so I was unable to archive them and get images of them because I was always under the impression that I could just go in there and get one, and they would always have them. But another sort of technique that I use quite often was the 3D, using the, it's not a 3D milling machine, but it's a model machine, which sort of cuts out from the foam, cuts out from sort of low density foam. And it was kind of great to instantly just send a file and have this sort of three-dimensional object sort of immediately was sort of satisfying in a way. So I used those resources almost on a daily basis for whatever our projects were. So now I want to go into one of the projects, or a series of the projects that were happened sort of on a consistent basis, which were the exhibition and lecture posters. With architecture schools and with art schools, it seems like these posters end up being sort of a pissing contest in a way, because they get sent to every school, and you can walk down the aisle and see sort of every institute's poster, and it's sort of a, who could stick their chest out the most, who did the best job. So it was always sort of an excitement for us to see what we could come up with. For this particular year, what I wanted to do was have the poster's material and the poster's form be able to transform from something as an object to something that is a poster that it could exist on the wall as sort of a three-dimensional, sort of had a sculptural fabric quality. So what I did was had the posters printed, and for every poster that was printed, as soon as I was at the press, as soon as they cut them and delivered them to me, I would crumple them in a ball, and for all, I think it was 2,000, were just instantly crumpled. And the printer was kind of freaking out, and the school was kind of freaking out because I was instantly sort of destroying them, turning it into sort of rubbish. But I knew that hopefully it was going to work. I figured it was going to work. So from there, what I had done was had them vacuum sealed, much like how you would vacuum seal or food. Completely suck the air out of it. So what was nice is that each one was different depending on how it was crumpled. So on the left, you can see as someone received the poster, they would open it, pop it open, uncrinkle it, and hang it on the wall. And the paper that was used was a really, really thin 40-pound text, really, really hard paper to print on, because with a big sheet like this with a lot of ink, when it's going through the press, it's picking up so much ink and getting sort of really wet that it sticks to the rollers and rips and breaks, and drove the printer sort of crazy. And so once it was printed and he was really excited about it, and then I crumpled them, he was kind of confused. So you could see on the left how it exists in its one state, and then on the right how it exists. And how it exists crumpled is really like a rock. It's pretty solid. And on the left is almost, it feels like a dollar bill in that it's the sound that it makes is completely different. Even when it wasn't crumpled, just as it's paper, its porosity completely was changed just by that simple sort of affecting. Another one of the ideas was to sort of blur the idea of interior and exterior in architecture, try to have that boundary expressed. So with this particular solution, it was using that same paper, that 40-pound text paper, and printing on the outside, or printing on the backside, the content backwards, and printing the dates on the front side. So as it was hung up against the wall, you could slightly see the content bleeding through. And it was kind of nice because no matter where you hung it, depending on the color of the wall behind it, it was legible, but that color behind it affected the color of the type that came through. So that's how you could see it up against a window. Quite legible. So, this is another solution that we kept for a full year. One thing at Sci-Arc that I did do is kind of quite often not always stick to a consistent sort of template or idea. The idea, like I said, was always about how these things existed as sort of material objects. So it was always sort of, I like when things stay the same, but also change at the same time. So for these series of posters, what was done was, as soon as they were printed, they were instantly folded into the size of 6x9 and then die cut. So as they were opened up like this, you create almost another sort of material, three-dimensional sort of fabric out of the paper. And so on one side, there's this really bright color, two sort of contrasting colors. So the light sort of would reflect off those cuts and create these sort of bright little shadows around the cuts. So you can kind of see how it opens. And it was kind of nice also to use them as sort of devices to flip open and close. So it could work almost as a calendar to sort of close which lectures were finished or which lectures have been completed. This is the same sort of solution with just a different shape that was cut out. And the shape that was cut out always really controlled the texture, but always controlled its sort of fragileness. Some of them were extremely fragile, like this one, and this previous one was actually not quite fragile. It actually held up fairly well. But it was the same idea of using these sort of contrasting colors. This is how it opens. This is a detail. You can see the shape of the cut. And that the cuts were always done the same. There would always be 4 cuts that were symmetrical, and they would always start from the sort of the 4 corners in. This was the last one, which so on the front side, you could kind of see there's a contrast in between that type that's in the background and then the full color of the background just box, the tone of that pink. But it was actually one color but 2 plates, so I did 2 hits of the same color. And the reason for that was I wanted to have really subtle contrast. And with using fluorescent inks, no matter what color you use to contrast it, it's not going to be the same. So with using the same color and just controlling the density on the press allowed for the images or the type in the background to be somewhat invisible. So here it is opening. A summer program at Sci-Arc, which is sort of an entry-level architecture program for students who have an interest in architecture but have no experience or knowledge about anything. It's sort of the basic elementary ideas in architecture called making a meaning. And for each year, each poster, what I tried to do was make something, make some sort of physical object that would eventually become the image for that type. So in this case, I tried to use model making techniques in architecture to make these letter forms. what we did is sort of put them on a string and sort of fish around with them, and they eventually just became, as you can see, the image for the poster. And this as well was done fairly quickly on newsprint, really immediate, and which was nice is these particular letter forms for this year, in this case, sort of became the logo for the program of that year. Another year, what I tried to do was sort of similar to what I did before, but was just using the wood shop to sort of produce a series of materials that would exist as sort of the image and the content for sort of these elementary ideas of architecture. So everything was sort of composed and photographed, and those images became sort of the identity of the program that year. This particular poster, which I think is quite funny now because I see this image, especially the image on the right, sort of everywhere you go now, especially if you're a fan of music, maybe you know. There's a band called the XX, and literally the cover is this exact same thing. But for this case, what I did was create a stencil of an X for the Save the Date exhibition, which essentially was called X Marks the Spot. And what I did was create about 100 or 150 of these just square shapes with X's, and I stenciled them all over the school, and I left these X's sort of just hanging around. And people kind of got freaked out by it because they had no idea what it was. They thought it was graffiti. They thought it was propaganda. They had no idea. And it existed for about, I'd say, a month. And I didn't tell the administration. I didn't tell anyone. The only people that knew were the guys in the wood shop who helped me with the laser cutting. So it created this huge sort of stir and a discussion about what's going on. Do we need to get cameras? Where are these coming from? And then I had to present the poster for this particular event. And when I showed them this, they thought I was lifting the idea of this X from the propaganda that was around the school. But I instantly told them that it was, I wanted to create sort of a anonymous sort of advertising campaign for this event. And so then these posters got printed and hung up, and instantly sort of everyone sort of would remember that event by this sort of shape. If that makes sense. And then people went back and would start to steal the little X's because they felt that was sort of a flyer for the show with no content on it, just purely an X. In this particular case, which was an exhibition that was curated by faculty but didn't actually exist on the campus. It existed at the Design Center. The idea was to do a catalog for an exhibition on architectural drawing and how we could do that catalog with pretty much no budget. I think like $100. But we wanted to do 500 catalogs, which is kind of impossible. And so since the show was about drawing and new ideas about drawing, the idea that I came up with was to just use all that money, the entire budget, to just print a cover and have blank paper made, which cost nothing, no printing, and make a 72-page catalog of just nothing, white paper. And the idea was that this, in hopes, would inspire people to make their own drawings and sort of create their own drawing catalog. And in a year's time, we would collect all the catalogs and have another exhibition of these catalogs. And the funniest thing was that with no printing in this catalog, just blank white pages, cut and bound, was like a nightmare. It was a nightmare to get made because the printer couldn't understand why I wanted to make a book with nothing in it. And I had to explain, like, no, just make a dummy with my cover. And then they sort of got it, but I thought it was the easiest thing, and we were able to make 500 catalogs for $100, which is crazy. So everyone sort of walked away with their own sketchbook, in a way. So that's sort of, that's where I want to end with all the Sci-Arc stuff. There's a ton more stuff that I have that's sort of on the table, and you're welcome to look at it later. Now I want to go on to Handheld Heart. And it's kind of, like I said, I was sort of juggling the responsibilities at Sci-Arc and those projects while I was doing Handheld Heart at the same time. One of the projects that I did as a sort of collaboration with an architectural firm called Durfee Rain was Gallery Row signage for the Gallery Row district in downtown. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a few square blocks, I think from 2nd until, at the time, 6th Street. But literally every day that we were working on this, it seemed like the district was growing and growing and growing and getting bigger and bigger. So that ultimately sort of affected not only our ideas, but affected the budget too, because we were given a certain budget that had extreme sort of restrictions as to how big this thing could be, how high it had to be on the pole, how much it could weigh. All those things sort of played into the form. And these were all ideas that I really had no experience with. So it really was sort of, for me, so abstract and kind of like sending, at first, like a rocket to the moon. It was like it was absolutely crazy. And one of the ideas was also from them was that these things only had to last 5 years. So we were figuring that they instantly felt that the district was maybe going to fail because, or the Gallery Row district would fail because if they only wanted these to last 5 years, maybe they thought that Gallery Row district wasn't going to be around much longer, or much more longer than 5 years. So some of the restrictions that we had, such as weight and dimension and size, it couldn't weigh over 15 pounds, and it couldn't be more than 8 square feet, I believe. So that instantly sort of narrowed down our materials. We couldn't do anything that was steel. We couldn't do anything that was plastic because we really had to consider weather and wind. If it's plastic, it's going to fade or it's going to fall down with wind. If it's steel, it's way too heavy. These things are 16 feet up on a pole. And also, one of the bigger ideas of the whole thing was how these things could really emphasize the idea of a row, and that this gallery district was sort of existed in rows on these streets. So we really let that idea play into the form of the object. The material that we used, we found a really, really lightweight honeycomb aluminum, which you see here, which is extremely durable, extremely strong, and extremely light and affordable. And this is stuff that they use for on airships and everything. So we knew with testing that it would sort of hold up. Especially here, we don't really have extreme weather changes, but sometimes. And it sort of fit into our budget and weight restrictions. What we had to design was a sort of mechanism to how these things could be fabricated and how they could really emphasize that idea of a row, but also speak to not only commuters by car, but to pedestrians on foot. And so the idea would be that these signs were double-sided, so you could see them from the street and you could see them from car, but also that they were, and I'm going to go up here, this is the image I have, that they were built in sections of 4 feet, and they ended up being 12 feet long. So they're really long, 12 feet and just 4 inches high. And that, what we were hoping was to do them a little bit bigger, like 5 inches high, but it ended up being like a half a pound over. And they were, sorry, it's too heavy, we can't hang that. So the actual shape and the form was, in the end, was a result of the weight. So it became legible, and it actually was practical from our sense. And how they were manufactured was, the type was stenciled on, and then they were sandblasted, and the technique of how the material or how the color was on there was the same of how a car is. It was automobile paint, because we knew with that paint it would withstand extreme weather, situations, especially here. So it kind of was a back and forth between the fabricator, automotive paint place, to us, to the city, and it took, I want to say, 3.5 years, maybe 3 years from start to finish, which by far is the longest thing I ever worked on. I was really obsessed with how they were going to hang these things, because we created a guide to how they would hang them, because they were sort of intricate, but if you followed the guide and you did a few, it was really easy. So we made 25 of them. That's what their budget allowed. And we picked poles within the district as to where to hang them. So at any given point in the district, you would be at least able to see 1 or 2. So essentially, the idea was that they would become not something you would have to read, but something you would just, they would become sort of signifiers. Like if you saw one from wherever you were, you, in hopes, knew you were in that district. They weren't necessarily signage that said, once you saw them, like, hey, there's a gallery right here where this sign is. They were just signifiers, like I said, because in that district, galleries were opening and closing sort of daily. When we started, there was, I think, 20 galleries, and by the time the project was finished, like I said, it was 4 more square blocks and maybe 25 more galleries. So we really couldn't have one per gallery, especially since it's so inconsistent. So it may seem like I'm jumping all over the place here with different sort of types of projects, but it sort of speaks as to the nature of sort of my practice, and that I will work on sort of, city signage to then going and working simultaneously on something as simple as like a 7-inch record packaging. For this particular project, what I did is I was on tour with the band for 3 months, and each night of the show, I would, for this particular record, make a new cover for that city and for that show exclusively. So you could just purchase that record that night. So over time, years later, you would remember exactly the date and the location of where you got that record. And so at the end of the tour, and I would make them the day of. So the day we got to Portland, I would make a cover, go Xerox it, and stuff the record in there, and usually make roughly about 50. Depending on the city, sometimes there would be 20 or 50 or 100. But in the end, it sort of became a nice document of the tour as to each location that was one that we sent to. At the end of the tour, what I did was compile sort of shapes from each city and compose a new cover that sort of collected all the formal qualities from those cities into a letterpressed cover. And so the nature of the variety of the colors or of the covers was something that that I liked, and it had this obsessive quality to it. But what I also did is how the record was pressed. As they were making the record with color vinyl, I had them constantly pouring different colors of vinyl beads into the tub. So each record that got pressed would slowly change color. So there wasn't really ever one record color that was the same. It was sort of constantly different. Another record for this band, so the previous bands that I was talking about is No Age, and they're a band from Los Angeles, and they're the band that they're a band I frequently collaborate with, not only music on packaging, but also with making music. For this particular record, what we did was, it was a 4-song record, and we wanted to, the title of the record first was Losing Feeling. And for us, we felt that that feeling of buying music and being obsessed about finding music was sort of a lost thing. And now, we find music, we don't really have to find it. It's just there. There's no sort of searching. We're losing our sort of connection to the music we listen to. So each song on that record was sort of given a sort of warped record of this idea of something being lost or something melting away. And as you pulled the packaging, this insert out of the record, it was kind of a morphed version of the previous version in front of it. So there's 4 different versions of that. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is switch to a live camera and show some more of the objects as physical things, more album packaging and books, but I really wanted to show them not as single images, but for you to be able to see them as objects and how they open and how they are as weighted things. So can you see that? Okay. All right. So the first thing that I want to show is another album packaging project that is with No Age, and this is the packaging that was, oddly enough, Grammy nominated. The title of the record sort of was Nouns, but sort of came out in our discussions while we were on tour. We wanted to create a packaging that not only was not exclusively about just the music or the band themselves, but sort of a celebration of nouns that sort of were them. So a sort of celebration of people, places, and things that were important to them as a band. And it was sort of I guess since we were on tour, we were kind of homesick. So it was kind of nice to go back and reflect on all these sort of things that were references to Los Angeles in a way. So it starts out with, a picture of the venue, the smell, and then sort of goes into more sort of personal images that relate to sort of their practice space, spaces where they played shows, but they were all sort of related to people they knew or people that sort of influenced them through the making of the record. So this is Santa Monica, the LA River. At times they would set up and play shows in the LA River, sort of unannounced. So if you were driving by and you heard something, you would say, oh my God, No Age is playing in the river. And then it sort of became a thing. Bands that influenced them, prior to being in their own band, sort of bands they listened to. So we kind of liked the idea of having other bands' material and other bands in the packaging. A restaurant that was the restaurant on the left, Vegan Express, was an old, I think it's still there, but was not only a restaurant, but was a venue where bands would play. Really, really small, 100 square feet. And for the band and myself, we would go there often to see bands, but it was really before we knew anything about being in a band or touring. And we would book bands to play shows there, but we didn't know that we had to pay them. We had no idea. We're like, oh, you're just here to play. That's great. And so to us, it was sort of a starting point too. We thought just getting them a free meal was like the best thing, but they needed gas money and money to live off. So each section of how it's divided is separated by these sort of colors. So then what we also did was each member sort of did a performance, a video performance that was reproduced in here as stills, but then you could go online and see the actual performance. So in this case, the band sort of wanted to, I let them sort of do what they wanted to do and sort of in terms of the idea for what sort of video they wanted to create. And they ended up becoming quite, I guess, serious. Especially this one looked kind of a bit serious, and I think they sort of regretted it later. But what he did was write some poetry on his face and washed it off. But I think it took a day to come off. So he was stuck with this dirty face with some words on there. And I think if you have tattoos on your face, you're considered insane. So it was kind of funny. So it went back onto photos of locations that sort of spoke to the band in terms of places where they played shows or places where they saw shows. So live photos of other bands playing. This is them playing on the right, playing a show at Amoeba. So it was kind of nice that in the end, the packaging sort of was a celebration of sort of their fans. So this is kind of funny. It was they were going to be, prior to them being on the label that they're on, Sub Pop, they were going to be on a different label, which is now no longer called Touch and Go. And they had a meeting to be on the label, and while they were there, they took some photos of the offices. And so these stickers are sort of a roster of the bands on that label. And so when we wanted to use it in the packaging, the label that they were on were sort of upset that we're sort of promoting bands on the other label, sort of the rival. And they told us to take it out and that they couldn't do it because of legal issues. But in the end, we sort of got away with it. But it's kind of funny. So more sort of portraits of fans. So on the left is sort of a stage portrait of the drummer's kit after a show, and on the right is sort of a portrait of the guitarist's sort of kit after a show. So a lot of these images were sort of taken on that same tour, and it was, for me, it was the process of designing a record while traveling was not only sort of extremely difficult, but I guess the outcome is completely sort of not experimental, but you have no idea how it's going to turn out because you're working in hotels. And then you're driving a lot, and you're maybe not looking at it for a few days, and then going back to it, and it really becomes sort of something where you're you're homesick and designing and uncomfortable, but I guess that's what I like. I guess. So this last picture is one of those images of them playing in the LA River. And all it ended up being was just a saddle-stitched 64-page booklet that is bound, glued into a standard sort of digipack. So it really wasn't anything that was customizable. It was sort of using pre-existing requirements for sort of music packaging, but just switching them up a little bit. So I want to quickly switch over to a catalog that I just finished sort of a few weeks ago for an LA artist named Aaron Curry. And what we wanted to do was create a catalog that wasn't necessarily like an exhibition catalog for his show, but became sort of an addition, and do a really limited run, but spend the same amount of money on it as we would if we were doing sort of a large run catalog. So in the end, the budget only, for what we wanted to do, the budget only let us do 100 copies, which extremely low. So he made work for the exhibition that was sort of made to exist in the book. So the book, in a way, became a piece. It was sort of an artwork. So ideas from his artwork were sort of expressed in the design. And in most cases, I sort of take a back seat to the content, especially with catalogs, and try to not let the design sort of overshadow the work. But in this case, it was sort of a sort of collaboration in that sense. So what I did is, with his collages that really play with this idea of foreground and background and the sort of space in between, is picked out shapes within his collages and had them die cut, as you could sort of see, and had them printed, had color printed on the inside. I don't know if you could kind of tell. That would reveal the inside material. So there. So in this piece, in this collage, this piece is actually really black. So throughout the catalog, you get these die cuts that reveal just the paper in between. So it really starts to play with the idea of the foreground and background as well. In this case, all that was die cut was the shape of the tape that he uses, and the color of the tape was printed on the inside. So they really start to blend in. And at first glance, you don't even really notice that there's die cuts. So this piece that's actually under there was the actual piece that he used in the collage. I liked that it sort of became this piece that the collages almost start to look like portraits in a way, and it's almost like a yearbook of portraits, in that the shapes of his collages tend to sort of be almost human-like. And they're all reproduced at scale, so 1-to-1 is so more die cut. And in some cases, there's nothing printed underneath, and it's just revealing the white. So it ended up being quite a lot of paper for such a small catalog, because of the binding technique and the folding of what this is called reverse fours. So each page is a 4-page signature, but it's bound on the reverse side and printed on the inside. So you could kind of see. So it's the gallery actually sells it as not as a catalog, but as an edition. Another catalog that I did for the same gallery was for the artist William E. Jones. And he did a documentary on Latino Morrissey fans in California. And what we tried to do was have the catalog sort of be a component to the documentary. And for a photo book, especially for me, I always felt that they sort of just designed themselves. But I wanted to figure out a way to say something about the content and the subject matter subtly through the design. So the work was organized chronology of the work was organized by a particular event that he would attend and document. So whether if it was a Smiths Morrissey cover band playing, or if it was the event at the Sweet and Tender Hooligans is the name, if it was at that event, or if it was at a New Year's Eve sort of Morrissey celebration birthday party. It was in order by event. And each image that was on a spread, the content would always share the eye line. So they always had the same sort of eye line. So the content on this, the subject matter and the content on this side would always be looking in towards the book, and the subject matter on this side would always be looking in the book. So they were always sort of looking at the same point, and almost like the idea that sort of Morrissey existed in the center, and they were all sort of looking towards him as though he's who they worship. So you could kind of see throughout all the subject matter looking in, almost as though he's performing. If for a particular sort of category, particular chapter, if there was no more, in this case, no more images that had the subject matter looking in this direction, I would just keep it blank. So in this case, there was no more that were looking this direction. So there was no more. And as soon as there was another one on this side, it became a new event. So what it sort of did was, throughout the catalog, is create these sort of random white pages that you kind of had to decipher. And a lot of times, the subject matter was sort of looking straight. And so I had to determine, well, does it feel like a left or right? So in many ways, there's pictures over here that sort of share the same eye line. So it was a series of photographs, and then towards the center, he wrote an essay for it. And stop me if you've heard this one before, but if you're a Morrissey fan, you know that's one of the. It's an amazing sort of Smith song, but it's sort of his a discussion and talking about the culture of Latino Morrissey fans. We then go into sort of show the images from the film, but to keep that sort of same idea of the content sort of sharing their eye line. The only situation in the book where that rule gets broken is when there's locations. So there's besides the portraits that he did take, he went to sort of all the locations that were documented in the documentary and did a sort of city portrait. In this case, this was Baldwin Park, and went on to Montclair and Fontana. And so the images quite reflect sort of the sound and the dreariness and of the Smiths and Morrissey, which sort of worked well in breaking up the sort of content. And then back to the subject. How I wanted to end the actual thing was to end with an image that felt like the show was over. A sort of destruction, like they were done playing, done performing. The show must go on, but for now it's over. onto some more music packaging. What I like to do for music packaging is, like I said, sort of create a narrative or create an experience with packaging. So really get involved not only in the conceptual ideas that the band has, but sort of develop ideas with them over time as they're writing the record that will influence me on how I approach the design. For this particular case with Liars, who are an LA-based band now, what we wanted to do was they had recently moved back from living in other parts of the world, recently moved back to Los Angeles to write this record, and we're feeling as though they were in their hometown, but almost felt like they were tourists in a way, like they were on an island of their own hometown. So what we wanted to do was develop this idea that perhaps they were in their own sort of environment, their own world, where they existed, where their own ideas existed, and that if you wanted to get a glimpse of them, you could, and how that idea would exist in a sort of sculptural sort of packaging. So how the photography was done first was each image was taken as a single image, and they would sort of move around in the image, and as it was stitched, they would exist in one image sometimes 10 or 15 times to give this sense of time, as though they were sort of alone in this location and sort of abandoned in a way. So we did 2 locations which were simultaneously. So this is one long image across the entire packaging on the outside, as you could see. That pulls out. And as you close it, it sort of exists as, you could read it as sort of a book like this, and read the images. And as you open it, you can keep the CD in there or take the CD out. And there's a hole in which you can sort of look in. See if I could. You can become a sort of voyeur. Let me try it. Yeah. So the inside of the packaging is one long image stitched together, and they exist. So the more you pull the packaging apart, the sort of more you see. And sort of you could really experience it like this and experience it like this. So it was kind of, it created a sort of, it was kind of nice to have this sort of experience with the packaging rather than just a nice cover and that was it. So the challenge was how to communicate these same ideas from CD to LP and then to something online, and how they can be somewhat similar with sort of extremely limited budgets. The vinyl version, let's see if I can pull it out. The vinyl version, which was somewhat the same but not as voyeuristic, had this on the front, and then you just sort of opened it up, and you got a glimpse of them on the inside, and this sort of pulls out. And sort of each song, or each image was recreated as a book. Another idea was, with the CD and the LP, was to have this idea as though they existed on this island, but were sort of lost and no one else could find them. And so to to have their music, if someone wanted to hear those songs sort of performed again, it would have to be by someone else and not them. So what we did was give the songs to other bands and have them cover them. And so the record came with not only their album with all the songs, but also a sort of covers album and interpretations of the songs. So you could listen to the Liar Sister World, or you could listen to the Interpretations Sister World. And the entire packaging came with the vinyl version of each album and the CD version of each album. I don't know. I think maybe 25, 30? No, 25. But really, for this, it's kind of worth it. Instead of you can have the vinyl, you can have the CD too. It's kind of nice. Maybe it's a little more. Maybe it's 35. But at least I think most people are more excited in purchasing this than, for me, if the vinyl or if a CD packing is extremely sort of standard and there's no sort of, nothing in there is considered. I almost feel like the band or the label just, wants me to download it. Yeah, maybe not. Let's see. I'll move on to this. This is from an exhibition at Rhoades this is for the photography school. Let me get these in order. Called When It's a Photograph. And the entire exhibition was recreated in this series of 6 sort of publications that all came housed together and existed sort of like this on the table in the exhibition. And so the idea was, how can this exist not only as a booklet, but could exist as posters, and could also be sort of something interactive and sort of seductive. So each booklet sort of was treated as though you can see like a sort of almost like a saddle stitch booklet, but was folded by hand and sliced in the middle with an image reproduced on the inside. And the problem with this is it can never be machine folded. Half of it's machine folded, but then someone has to physically take it, unfold it, and refold it by hand. So half the budget goes into just folding. And so what's nice, though, is that you get the full effect of having a booklet and a poster with this way. If you don't do this slice and you fold it regular, you're going to get pages from the poster side that interrupt your booklet. So the entire exhibition was reproduced in here, and 2 of them existed as the foreword and the introduction, and a conversation between 2 of the artists. So the ones that were conversations didn't use any images, just sort of a quote on what the exhibition actually is. I don't know if you could see that, but so. Let's see. So I'm going to show a few more things. I want to actually end with that. Let's see. One more sort of Sci-Arc thing. In the gallery, the Sci-Arc Gallery, there was an exhibition whatever happened to LA, which is a sort of analysis of architectural and urban experiments in Los Angeles from 1970 to 1990. What the idea was and the ideas with the catalog and the ideas with the exhibition was to use, reopen sort of a series of texts and recorded material that had already sort of been published in European and American journals. And many of these texts which were sort of seminal or even lost and sort of forgotten. But the idea was to sort of bring them to the surface again to create a discussion about what's happening with Los Angeles architecture and its sort of architectural identity. In this particular case, we really had no budget to ask for rewritten texts or contributions for new texts on the subject. So it was perfect for us to just go out there and find what's already been published and let that become the content for our catalog. And what I wanted to do was find those texts and images and reproduce them, not only just not to fit the catalog, but reproduce them at the scale that they originally existed. So treat them exactly as they were existed. So in many cases, quite a bit of the content would be cut off. So I just would center it on the page at the scale it was. In many cases it worked, and in many cases it's sort of different. But what was nice is I would get sort of inconsistent margins and borders and inconsistent sort of type treatments. But I liked that it had a sort of a zine quality to it. And we didn't have to get the rights to the material if we did it this way. And we didn't have to pay the writers. And in many cases, the writers, they were so old, the texts, that they didn't exist in any other format. We would have to retype them or something. In this particular case, there was the text came from some sort of bootleg copy, and so half of it was cut off, but we could not find it anywhere else. But you could see this margin gets messed up. Images get cropped, the caption gets cut off. Same situation here where it was really from a bootleg copy. Am I okay on time? Should I show one more thing? Okay, I'm going to show one more thing. I'm going to end with a project that is sort of related to the very first image that I showed, which was this record right here. If you could kind of see. I recently, I had been working on this book for designing and editing for just under 2 years. And it's a collection of 7-inch records from the US that had a sort of non-conventional, non-traditional approach to how they were packaged. And in many ways, like I said, this was sort of my step into design. So it was not just nostalgic, but was sort of a rabbit hole that I stepped into as I started it. Not only in figuring out what the content was, but if I knew about these records that exist, like how would I find them? About 70% of the records in here were from my own collection, but I had to sort of scour the collections of other record collectors who had them. So how the book was broken down was not necessarily by how the records were made or by any sort of musical taste or style, but were broken down by geography. So what I did was created 7 geographies throughout the US that I sort of predetermined. So I had Southern California, Northern California, which we all know, but my sort of Midwest geography was a total hodgepodge. I had Arizona in the Midwest, and I had Michigan in the Midwest. So it was my own predetermined sort of Midwest, what I thought the Midwest was. So the majority of the records in here not only dealt with issues of them being as objects, but also issues that dealt with the sort of economies of scale. Much like the records that I was putting out, these records were done with limited budgets, but also done in a way that used sort of printing techniques that you could sort of do yourself. People often refer to a lot of the content in here as do it yourself, but I kind of like to refer to it as do it ourself, because it's really a collective of a sort of whole community of bands and labels. So one sort of running theme throughout the book was sort of the obsessiveness in versions of records. So with every version, there could be sort of multiple sort of formats and techniques. It really runs from being sort of standard, record size to sort of die-cut, hand-cut, glued-in records, to each record being burned with a blowtorch, to using piano paper. The subject and the object of them is really sort of all over the place. This isn't self-published. This is done by a publisher in New York who I collaborate with quite often. This is the first book of 3 books that I'm doing. But this one was way more work than I could ever expect in terms of just the research that was put into it. Finding every record, getting every record, and then determining and figuring out how these things were made. I would have a record, but not really know if it was letterpressed or screen printed or drawn on by hand, or what the material was in some cases, and sort of producing those captions in a way that sort of would make sense. And so it sort of goes out. In this case, the budget for the book as an object, I didn't want the book to be this really heavy, or this really thick-looking sort of catalog that felt like we had every single record that was ever produced in this way in the catalog. I kind of wanted it to be a little more conscious and sort of subtle. So I used a paper stock that was extremely thin, and almost it gave the weight of the book. It feels heavy, but it really doesn't look like that. Really doesn't look like 412 pages. But as soon as you thumb through it, you realize, oh wow, there's quite a bit in here. And so the design process of how I did it as well was I didn't want to scan these records and just be tweaking them, twoggling them like on the page. I wanted the objectness of them to really come through. So I designed the entire book as photographs. I made, much like this, I made an outlined area of proportions to the book, and I would put the records down and they would be photographed. So I kind of designed it in camera in a way. So it really just became a series of photographs. And so that's why a lot of things sort of bleed off the page, because this was my live area, and I knew what I had to fit in there, and if something couldn't fit, it would get cropped. And everything is reproduced at proportionate to each other. So.
How much?
45. Yeah, I really wanted to end with something that I started with, to see how my practice sort of, has not only changed or come full circle, but it's the more I change and the more the projects change, my process of what I did before I was a designer is still sort of influencing my ideas today, especially with records and music and how I approach my design process. So I'm happy to end with this. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah. Are there any questions?
How is designing something with your own work different from designing something that's not your work or a catalog?
I would say that you have a more, at least my own self, I have sort of a closer relationship to that content, and I think feel more connected to it. And there's sort of, it seems more free and more open and less restrictions. Or if it's someone else's work, I really got to consider their work, in ways that they hope to have it reproduced. With the 7-inch book, I didn't have to refer to anyone. It was sort of really author and designer, which is a sort of role I like to play with a lot of the projects, is to not only give shape and form to the projects, but to also have a say in the content, or at least discuss the content and have a discussion about it as to what goes in, what goes out. But I think dealing with my own content is sort of it. I approach it the same, but I think there's more creative freedom, like when it's my own.
Anyone else?
I just had a quick question about putting together 7 inches. There's sort of a craft element, I guess. You got to like put them together.
Yeah.
How does that process inform your design practice?
That's a good question, because putting out records, I was involved in every step, from getting the record made to getting it, printed. How would I print it? To having my bedroom filled with record covers as I'm folding them, and my room smells like ink, and I can't sleep. It really affects it now, because I feel like if I'm getting something printed and the printer says, "Oh, we can't fold these. It's just going to be too hard," I think, "Oh well, I know how to fold. Maybe I could do it. I could put them in my bedroom, and I know how to fold, and that's not a problem." So I always forget that I can. That having sort of that, being involved in that process, from the craft, from every step, from design to production to distribution, is something that's still ingrained in my mind, where I kind of don't mind doing those things that are more craft involved. If it's like folding or cutting or collating. So yeah. Does that answer? Yeah.
Did your experiences in music and kind of inviting people, like your audience, to experience, have a effect in making your print work more interactive, more object-oriented, or have you always had that sentiment about your work?
I think I was sort of always had a sort of obsessiveness with physical things, and had a sort of OCD collector sort of personality. When I was a kid, I would sort of collect so many things, from like quarters to bugs to books to anything. And so I always was like obsessed with the object and how people would respond to my things or my objects. And so I think that's why my work is very much tactile, and the physicalness of it comes through as an object. Yeah. But its relationship to music, I guess I never really, that sort of just came with being, wanting to make like things, real things. And that's why I didn't last at an ad agency because I never made anything real. You know, just made some images that were on the screen that were going to be real things, but you know, in the end, they weren't.
So on that note of like working with, or like having a tendency to work with things physically and making things that are so interactive physically, is that something, do you think, that attracted you to working for Sci-Arc, being like an architecture place?
Yeah, I think definitely, and I didn't realize that at first. I knew that the school had a sort of visually rich design history, but at the same time, I didn't know that, and then in the end, after being there for a short period of time, I realized it was sort of a perfect marriage, and it definitely sort of changed the way and affected the way I think about materials and you know, materiality of paper and how it's folded, just by being in the institute and seeing sort of architectural techniques in folding and model making. So it was, I definitely was inspired, but there was never a sort of direct sort of response to that, you know, through the work. But,
I wanted to ask, a lot of your work that you show, you appreciate a little more once you've explained it. It's not so obvious, and so I was wondering how you address that in, you know, once your product sells. Like, some things seems like there is a level of like instruction involved, or you just leave it up to the user to find that. Like,
yeah, I almost always leave it up to the user, because there's really, you know, the only way I could have everyone know that is to have sort of descriptions of it online, which I sort of do, but I kind of want the user to figure it out and create, let them sort of figure out what they think it means. You know, maybe they're wrong, maybe they're right, but I think the work may seem sort of obvious, but there's always a sort of subtle underlying idea in every project. Sometimes it's more obvious than others, but I like to see people's response and want to know what they think it means, rather than saying, here's what it is, here's what it means. But, yeah.
Any other questions? I guess that's it. Well, Brian
Yeah,
will
you
be...
can come up here and look at all this stuff.
Yeah,
too,
Brian will be
please.
teaching here till spring.
Yeah.
And he will be working here. He's also working on Peter Loenveld's new publication, which is going to be print and digital.
It's going to be a physical thing, an experience as a printed book, but also as digital, as a digital book, and how the relationship, how those sort of respond to each other. And, yeah.
Thanks for
Yeah,
your lecture.
Thank you.